Chapter 4. The Anthropology of the State. Of central importance to any doctrine of the state is its anthropology, its concept of man. In analysing the various doctrines which have been held over the centuries, it is best, rather than discussing every variation of theory, to deal instead with the major kinds of theory. In terms of this, let us consider first a very important tradition having deep roots in antiquity, the classical view of man. This classical view was marked in Greek thought and elsewhere by deeply rooted dialectical tensions. Thus, man was seen as a union of two alien elements of form, idea, reason, or spirit, with matter, will, particularity, or flesh. The one represented a higher element and the other a lower one. Thus, man's life was a focus for a dialectical tension deeply embedded in all reality. How one regarded man depended in part on whether one held that reason or will had the ascendancy in man. Plato gives us Socrates' view. In Kathleen Freeman's summary, quote, Socrates came to two chief conclusions: that virtue is knowledge, and that no man sins willingly. He assumes that every man is seeking what he believes to be for his advantage and welfare, but he is often mistaken in his choice of action and does wrong in the belief that he is getting something for himself. If he knew the truth, he would realize that in making a wrong choice, committing a sin for the sake of some immediate apparent advantage like pleasure or power, he is really doing himself not good but harm. If he could see further, he would reject the immediate wish because of the harmful consequences to himself. Thus, all virtue consists in recognizing what is truly for our good, all sin in mistaking something harmful for something good. If we have the necessary knowledge, we are bound to choose correctly, for no one but a lunatic would willingly choose what is to his hurt. The wrong choice or sin is always to our hurt. The right choice, or virtue, is always to our advantage. Socrates thus eliminated the will, making it automatically dependent on the reasoning faculty. Man to him is a creature with intelligence which can be developed by inquiry and search until it recognizes the good. His goal is happiness, and this is achieved when his intelligence, by recognizing the good, enables him to choose it. Therefore, he will do well to let nothing interfere with his study of the good. Bodily desires must be controlled, the pursuit of wisdom must be set before any worldly advantage, and he must devote his life, in company with his friends, to the elimination of ignorance about the nature of virtues and virtue as a whole. End quote. This would appear to be a very optimistic view of man, but in reality it meant a thorough pessimism both about virtue or knowledge, the two being equated, and about man. Socrates declared, quote, It has been proved to us by experience that if we would have pure knowledge of anything, we must quit the body. End quote. Pure knowledge and pure virtue are thus impossible without an end to the dialectical tension between mind and body, that is, without death. Pure knowledge or virtue can be approximated in this life only by men who live the life of reason, the philosophers. The whole point of the Republic of Plato is that the world, or the state, for its salvation, needs the rule of philosopher kings. The classical view of man has been described as a distrust of man, but it is in reality a distrust of non-philosophical man and an assertion of a radical trust in man the philosopher. Because of this virtual monopoly of knowledge or virtue by the philosopher, it follows that rule or kingship belongs to him. This classical view was also the position of the Enlightenment philosophers up to Rousseau, and it is again the position of Marxists, Fabian socialists, behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, and many others. The dialecticism underlying classical anthropology led to conflicting views of sociology and psychology. The nature of man in classical anthropology is one of a dialectical tension between form and matter, mind and body, between that which partakes of universals and that which is of the world of particulars. The state for Socrates was the world of unity, and, quote, the greater the unity of the state, the better, end quote. Aristotle, however, recognized that a total emphasis on unity meant the obliteration of man by the state, so that he insisted on some emphasis on the individual. Quote, I am speaking of the premise from which the argument of Socrates proceeds, quote, that the greater the unity of the state, the better, end quote. Is it not obvious that a state may at length attain such a degree of unity as to be no longer a state? Since the nature of a state is to be a plurality and intending to a greater unity from being a state, it becomes a family, and from being a family, an individual, for the family may be said to be more than the state, and the individual than the family, so that we ought not to attain this greatest unity, even if we could, for it would be the destruction of the state, end quote. However, Aristotle, while conscious of the danger of a totalitarian state, had no real philosophical safeguard against it, since for him, also, the emphasis on unity was very important. He held, moreover, that, quote, the state is a creation of nature, and that man is by nature a political animal, end quote. If man is created by God, then man is defined by God and is a religious creature. However, if man is a political animal, then man is the creature of the state. Thus, for Hellenic thought and for all those in the classical tradition, man is a creation of the state. On the other hand, Aristotle, in his Psychology of Man, was, like Plato, essentially an anarchist. Man, in his unhappy union of mind and body, was caught in a world of particularity, and, as an individual or particular, was governed by a psychology of particularity. For Aristotle, quote, the good, end quote, is, quote, that at which all things aim, end quote. The end of the good of both man and the state is that which is good for man. However, quote, for even if the good of the community coincides with that of the individual, the good of the community is clearly a greater and more perfect good, both to get and to keep. This is not to deny that the good of the individual is worthwhile, but what is good for a nation or a city has a higher, a diviner quality, end quote. This is clearly totalitarian and stresses again the centrality of the state in the life of man. Man is the creature of the state, and the state enables man to attain the highest good. However, Aristotle defines the highest or final good as happiness, and happiness is self-sufficiency. Quote, it is a generally accepted view that the final good is self-sufficient. By, quote, self-sufficient, end quote, is meant not what is sufficient for oneself living the life of a solitary, but includes parents, wife and children, friends and fellow citizens in general. For man is a social animal. A self-sufficient thing, then, we take to be one which on its own footing tends to make life desirable and lacking in nothing. And we regard happiness as such a thing. Add to this that we regard it as the most desirable of all things without having it counted in with some other desirable thing. For if such an addition were possible, clearly we should regard it as more desirable when even the smallest advantage were added to it. For the result would be an increase in the number of advantages, and the larger sum of advantages is preferable to the smaller. Happiness, then, is the end to which all our conscious acts are directed, is found to be something final and self-sufficient, end quote. Self-sufficiency as the highest good is an anarchistic goal, and Aristotle tried to limit it to the society of man rather than to the individual. The Greek city-state aimed at self-sufficiency, as did the mercantilist state of 18th century Europe and the neo-mercantilist world of the 20th century. Aristotle's limitation was, however, arbitrary. Why not self-sufficiency as an individual role? This is indeed the direction of Greek psychology and life, an emphasis on the self-sufficiency of man. The Neoplatonists, Stoics, Cynics, and others all emphasized in various ways man's self-sufficiency. Classical anthropology, thus, had an ambivalent position, moving from totalitarianism to anarchism quite readily. The nature-freedom dialectic of modern philosophy gives it the same tendency, an emphasis on the totalitarian savior state, a world state, and an omnipotent state on the one hand, and on the other, the protectionist autonomous nation-state and the anarchistic individual. Both man and the state claim to be universals and absolute particulars. Both man and the state see themselves as the final judge and arbiter of all things, and both decide issues in relationship to themselves. Another aspect of the anthropology of this classical view of man, common to all non-biblical doctrines, is its view of man as a product of blind chaos and chance, an evolutionary and accidental product. Man thus has no constant or God-given nature. Dialectical reality may impose certain limitations on man, or as in Freud, a long primordial history may leave its mark, but man is essentially a product of his environment and has no necessary or constant nature. Man is thus plastic man, readily molded to whatever form the molder desires. Man is a blank sheet of white paper, an open and plastic mind, and whoever controls the childhood and education of man thereby controls the future. Plato, Aristotle, Locke, Pavlov, Freud, Dewey, and all other statists thus have insisted on the control of the child and his education. This doctrine of plastic man begets totalitarianism, whether of the Church, because Aquinas shared this view, or mainly of the state, because it holds that total powers can produce total change. Holding this view, the philosopher kings can dream of creating a totally new world order simply by attaining total control over man and his education. Not surprisingly, the acceptance of the theory of evolution quickly produced worldwide totalitarian movements. Marx and Engels were delighted with the publication of Darwin's theory in 1859, and both recognized at once that it made their socialistic philosophy inevitable. An evolving, changing man is malleable man, and the road to utopia, to a new paradise on earth, is total ability to change man. When man holds to a fixed, God-given nature in man, then he cannot believe that totalitarian powers in the state can undo God's handiwork. This ancient, classical view of man, still very much with us and greatly developed by the Enlightenment and evolutionary philosophies, is a fertile ground for a radical statism and a radical anarchism. In its totalitarian form, it offers us a savior state as man's hope. The modern state and all its political parties in varying degrees offer us rival plans of salvation by acts of status law, cradle to grave security, the conquest of poverty, disease, death, and war. All these and more are promised by candidates whose program is openly messianic and radically salvationist. On the other hand, existential anarchism must deny the state and other men. For Sartre, other men, neighbour and stranger alike, are the devil, since he is his own God. For existentialists, the freedom of man is expressed, 1. By the unmotivated act to demonstrate a radical independence from God and man, and 2. The best unmotivated act is the act of arbitrary cruelty, because it emphasizes our independence from God and man. The modern state similarly declares its independence from God by means of a brutal contempt for God and his law. It fosters a theory of elitism which reduces all men other than the philosopher kings or scientific socialist planners to the status of experimental animals. A second kind of approach, one more modern and more pervasive in our culture, is the democratic view of man. To a large degree today, this view prevails in Western civilization, and the elitist or classical view uses the facade of democracy to operate. Behind the Iron Curtain of communism, the facade of ballots, democracy, and the dignity of all men disguises a radical scientific elitism. In the democratic anthropology, strong elements of which are derived from Rousseau, man is naturally good, and only institutions and a bad environment lead to evil or sin on his part. Ostensibly, this doctrine of man gives man great dignity. In reality, it reduces man radically. If man is naturally good, and yet he is historically perverted and evil, then man is in essence a very weak being whose natural goodness is at best frail, and man at best passive in relationship to nature. The democratic anthropology replaced God with nature and made man the creature of nature and the world of men. Even more than the classical or elitist view, the democratic anthropology views man as plastic or malleable, and it has led to a heavy emphasis on propaganda, education, and status controls towards remaking man. Since evil is not in men, but in the institutions surrounding men, the road to salvation means revolution, the overthrow of those institutions to free man for the bliss of an anarchistic paradise, a stateless world in which men in society function perfectly without benefit of clergy or state. Of course, in the bastard forms of this theory were blended with elitism, an elite group of planners or a dictatorship of the proletariat will guide the people state through the, quote, great society, end quote, or status phase to the, quote, great community, end quote, or anarchistic phase. Socialism will give way to stateless communism. Pythagoras had said, quote, man is the measure of all things, end quote, and both the elitist and democratic anthropologies have held to this position. In both, however, the practical or theoretical, but always inescapable consequence has been that a few men are the measure of all things and play God over all other men. In the democratic view, vox populi, vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. There has thus been no appeal beyond that infallible voice, whether incarnate in the democratic majority or in the democratic consensus. The democratic view has led to the proliferation of institutions and the institutional and organizational control of man. If bad institutions such as the church have made men bad, then good institutions will make man good. John Dewey attacked the church, that is, the Orthodox, Bible-believing church, as a hopelessly aristocratic institution because it believes in heaven and hell, the saved and the lost, and good and evil, all hopelessly aristocratic concepts. More than 2 decades later, Conant made the same statement about the family. Every family seeks the best for its own children, thereby ensuring inequality of opportunity. Thus, church and state, being anti-democratic, must go. Some educators have said the same for Christian schools and colleges. Society must be rid of anti-democratic institutions to make man wholly subject to democratic institutions. Every Congress, Parliament, Assembly, or Legislature regularly creates new agencies or institutions towards this beneficent remaking of man. Precisely because the Christian Church represents the contradictory view of man, the democratic state is implicitly or explicitly hostile to Christianity. The rise of democracy has seen, on the one hand, the progressive abandonment of Christianity by many states in favour of humanism, and, on the other, a radical persecution of Christianity. Christianity is not compatible with totalitarianism, nor with the developing forms of humanistic politics from monarchy to democracy. As a result, in the modern state, the usual choice of a voter who is a Christian is between the lesser of two statist evils. The anthropology of both the left and the right is anti-Christian. The conservatives, being usually less advanced and less systematic, represent the statist evil in milder form. Their position is still not theologically founded, except in a minority of cases. The third kind of doctrine which has influenced our world is biblical anthropology. In terms of this faith, Man was created wholly good by God, Genesis 1:31, and although fallen and reprobate outside of Christ, is still not to be regarded as normal in his fallen or sinful estate. Sin is an abnormality and a deformation of man, destructive of man and his society. It is in essence suicidal. Quote, "But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death." Proverbs 8:36. Man must be viewed in terms of his original righteousness, but the fact of his total depravity outside of Christ cannot be ignored. Man is not a plastic man. He cannot be made a creature of the state or of his environment. Man is changed not by the state nor by the church or school, but primarily by God's eternal counsel, effectual calling and regenerating grace, Romans 8:28-32, and secondarily by his own will. God acts and man responds to that act, which in itself creates man's response. Pagan psychologies have often influenced the church. Aquinas held to the blank paper view of man, following Aristotle here. For him, the intellect was a passive power. As a result, the church took the road of power and control over man as the means of saving him. Arminianism, the Protestant version of scholasticism, shares this same faulty anthropology in varying degrees and is thus prone to be favourable to statism. The various Reformed churches, now largely Arminian, hold to a similar trust in the state as the saving institution. From a biblical perspective, however great and terrifying the power of the state or any other institution may become, its ability is still strictly limited because only God can change man, and society can only be remade as man is remade and then acts in terms of the creation mandate to exercise dominion under God. It was this confidence that motivated Luther when he wrote, quote, "And though this world with devils filled should threaten to undo us, we will not fear, for God hath willed his truth to triumph through us. The prince of darkness grim, we tremble not for him. His rage we can endure, for lo, his doom is sure. One little word shall fail him." In terms of a biblical anthropology, man is not plastic man. He is not nor ever can be a creature of the state, of sociologists and psychologists, nor can he be a creature of church or school, nor of his parents, even if he tries to be, so that he can neither be made by them nor blame them. Responsibility is located not in parents, church, state, school, or environment, but in man himself. It was an aspect of their sin that led Adam and Eve to attempt to palm off their guilt and responsibility to one another, to the tempter, or to God, Genesis 3. The essence of social quote-unquote primitivism is the absence of a sound doctrine of responsibility. Quote-unquote savage man does not blame himself for the errors of judgment or for bad health. He asks a medicine man or a witch doctor to find the person who has cast a bad spell on him. Among the Iroquois, there were at times wholesale executions of people suspected of casting evil spells. Biblical psychology has made social progress possible by bringing personal responsibility to the forefront. It has stressed the responsibility of man and has forbidden its transfer to society or institutions. Ezekiel declared, quote, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The son shall not bear the iniquity of the father, neither shall the father bear the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him." Ezekiel 18:20. The implications of the biblical doctrine of man and his psychology are anti-statist and require freedom for man to develop or feel in terms of his responsibilities under God. They are also anti-anarchist in that it is not man who is the ultimate governor, but God. Man has power, but by the permission of God only, and man's power is limited power, so that whenever man and his institutions are established, There we must have an area of limited power. To aim at more is both to sin against God and to invite his inevitable judgment. The usurpation of powers is an invitation to judgment. Modern politics, because it is premised on a false doctrine of man, is thus inescapably anti-Christian in its character. It will work to subvert Christianity, either explicitly or implicitly, consciously or unconsciously. At present, the basic choice which confronts the Christian voters is not one of basic philosophy, but of degrees of adherence to that philosophy. Every political party rests on non-Christian principles, and the only real question is, which party is least systematic in its anti-Christian philosophy? A metaphysical presupposition is also at stake. The myth of evolution has given modern man a radically different perspective on reality. In terms of Scripture, the whole of the universe and all things therein, and all things in heaven are the handiwork of the sovereign and triune God. All things move in terms of God's sovereign purpose, in terms of a glorious and unchanging harmony, so that Asaph could declare, quote, "Surely the wrath of man shall praise thee," Psalm 76:10. And St. Paul concluded, quote, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose," Romans 8:28. This faith means that all things in creation need one another, are interdependent, and serve a purpose beyond themselves, so that their own will can never be made the final will. In eras influenced by Christian presuppositions, even non-Christians adopted ideas and philosophies which were secular adaptations of theocentric philosophy. Thus, while the philosophy of laissez-faire ascribed the ultimate harmony to nature, it did see an ordained harmony of interests in all creation. It was a secular adaptation of the Christian doctrine of providence. The same was true of free trade thinkers. They assumed an ultimate harmony of interests which was untenable without the presupposition of the sovereign, predestinating God of Scripture. William Cullen Bryant, while not an orthodox Christian, clearly recognized this fact. A strong man, he noted, can lift his own weight, and much more, but he said, a man who can lift 200 pounds, although he weighs himself only 160, cannot lift himself. Quote, "Another must perform the office. The force must come from without." End quote. So too the harmony of interests rests not on man's intentions, but on the nature of reality. Quote, "There is a great law imposed upon us by the necessities of our condition as members of human society, the law of mutual succour, the interchange of benefits and advantages, the law of God and nature commanding us to be useful to each other. It is the law of the household, it is the law of the neighbourhood, it is the law of different provinces included under the same government, and well would it be for mankind if it were in an equal degree recognised as a law to be sacredly regarded by the great community of nations in their intercourse with each other. Were that law to be repealed, the social state lose its cohesion and fall in pieces. There is not a pathway across the fields, nor a high road, nor a guidepost at a turn of the way, nor a railway from city to city or from state to state, nor a sail upon the ocean, which is not an illustration of this law. It is proclaimed in the shriek of the locomotive. It is murmured in a ripple of waters divided by the prow of the steamer. The nation by which it is disregarded, or which endeavours to obstruct it by artificial barriers against the free intercourse of its citizens with those of other countries, revolts against the order of nature and strikes at its own prosperity. End quote. The widespread acceptance of the evolutionary mythology soon undercut the belief in the harmony of interests and replaced it with the theory of the conflict of interests. Evolution means the struggle for survival of species against species, each creature against all others, so that all the universe is a product both of blind chance and a war unto death of all creatures. It means a dog-eat-dog universe, every man for himself, and a killer-be-killed world. Tennyson confronted with evolution, tried hard to maintain some kind of higher harmony, but he still had to see nature red in tooth and claw, a world of destruction and ruthlessness. Evolution means a total conflict of interests, which, in politico-economic terms, as Marx and Engels at once recognise, means class conflict. Now that status education is totally influenced by Darwinism, not surprisingly, all classes and groups believe in the conflict of interest. Capitalists are as dedicated to an anti-free market economy as are the workers. Industrialists advocate tariffs, assume that conflict is inescapable, and act as though labour were an enemy. Labour treats capital as an enemy, and agriculture holds the city and its capital and labour forces alike to be its enemies. Class warfare has become the basic premise of politics, and by 1960 the Negros had picked up the same mythology, as have other so-called minority groups since, notably Mexicans, Indians, and women. The conflict of interest faith creates a warfare society, a state of permanent war as natural and inevitable. In a warfare society, the power of the state grows rapidly, in that the state both incites the warfare by legislation, which assumes a conflict of interests, and then presents itself as the referee. A good example of class conflict legislation is the minimum wage law. Supposedly, it was to help unskilled labour by assuring a reasonable minimum wage. In reality, it led to unemployment and the Black Revolution of the 1960s, as well as to youth problems. Whereas previously unskilled youth could be employed and given on-the-job training, now the cost was too great for such apprenticeships. The percentage of unemployed youth, black and white, has risen steadily, and conflicts, delinquency, and other problems as well. Status interference based on a conflict of interest philosophy has been responsible. The conflict philosophy is inescapable on an evolutionary premise. It can only be undercut by the biblical doctrine of creation. The philosophy of statism is anti-Christian to the core. The necessity of our day is not political action, but a return to a biblical faith. On any but a biblical doctrine of man, the state increases its power and plays the role of God and Saviour over man.